thinking.
Joining me is Leith Van Onselen, co-founder of Macro Business and a former Federal Treasury official. I recommend his Macro Business site. Great articles there. Leith, great to see you again. Look, inflation's still far too high. Why didn't the Reserve Bank hike interest rates? It said that was the other option it had. Either freeze them where they are now, which it did, or hike them, not cut them.
Yeah, Andrew, the RBA is trying to balance basically two competing priorities. So one of them is obviously to try and keep inflation within its target of 2 to 3%. We're above that, obviously. But the other one is the Reserve Bank's trying to maintain full employment, and the economy is, as you said, is incredibly weak. We've had 5 consecutive quarters of negative per capita GDP growth. We're about to record a 6th. That will end up being the longest per capita decline, basically in records going back to the 1970s. Not the deepest, but the longest. And because of that, obviously, we've got rising unemployment and the consumer economy is deep in recession. And because of that, the RBA's held.
Well, it's interesting. We see the opposition today blaming government spending, which has gone up 16%. Federal government spending 16% in 2 years. Incredible. State governments also spending like drunken sailors, a massive amount. The Reserve Bank governor today said, oh, look, sure, that goes up, but other things go down. I'm not sure, trying to be really diplomatic. But what do you think is the problem? Is it that? Is it too little productivity? Is it too much immigration? What is weakening the economy and making interest rates so high and not falling?
Yeah, look, a lot of it does get down to policy failure. So obviously we've got the federal government pumping demand through its extreme levels of immigration. That's pushing up inflation across the economy, especially in areas like rents. We have the energy policy failures, which has Australia paying some of the highest energy prices in the world. That obviously feeds into cost of living, inflation, sending our manufacturers broke, etc. And then at the same time, we have state governments spending, record amounts on infrastructure. So we have what a fellow economist, Tarek Brooker, describes as a burnout economy, whereby the federal government has the foot planted on the accelerator while the Reserve Bank's got the foot planted on the brake trying to slow the economy. So the federal and state governments are working at cross purposes.
Now, you've in fact warned, and you mentioned it just earlier, referred to it in passing, you did a great article on this, that Australia's in its worst recession in modern times, with our average household disposable income falling like a stone. That's the bottom line there in blue. Now, we actually did another Vox Pop here at Sky News today that showed what that looks like to many Australians. Have a listen.
How's it affecting you at the moment? The
interest rate, the rents. It's going up all the time.
Well, we've got to listen to the people that are doing it tough.
Well, we decided to move back to my parents a couple of months ago after my 2-year mortgage was up, the fixed rate. We couldn't afford the new interest rate. So, yeah, we're back home now.
Yeah, I feel for them. I really do. But as long as that interest rate is up high, I get more money and I can survive.
Leith, it drives me nuts that the government carries on like, oh no, it's all going tickety-boo because, overall, we're growing because of the huge immigration. People are really hurting. There's no sense of crisis that this is, as you say, per capita, a terrible recession. Why is that?
Yeah, mate. Well, it's an absolute shocker for basically 2/3 of Australians. So roughly 1/3 of Australians rent. They're obviously getting smashed by this extreme rental inflation that we're getting, primarily caused by the surge in immigration. And then another 1/3 of Australians roughly have owner-occupier mortgages, and they're getting smashed, obviously, by these, a 50% increase in their mortgage repayments. So, 2/3 of the Australians getting smashed. The only 1/3 of Australia that's doing okay are those who own the homes outright, because they are basically insulated from these rental pressures and mortgage interest rates. So that's essentially why Australians are doing it so tough. And then you add other things like the energy policy failure, which is, ramped up gas and electricity prices, insurance price shocks, all those sorts of things. It's a recipe for disaster, Andrew.
It's interesting that what you mention is basically government failure. You're not saying Ukraine, you're not saying Russia, you're not saying America, you're not saying Japan, you're not saying China, like the Treasurer was busy doing today. Leith Van Onselen, great. Thank you very much for your time. And like I say, some great pieces on Leith's site. So I recommend you go Macro Business. After the break, yet another Brittany Higgins court case, and this one could really embarrass the Albanese government.
My name is Manny Carudis, and I'm a former New South Wales policeman turned investigative reporter with a passion for missing persons cases. I'm here to quickly tell you about our True Crime Australia podcast, The Missing. In this series, I look at old missing persons cases which have all gone cold in an attempt to try and uncover new information which could help see these missing people reunited with their loved ones, or any form of clue that could bring these families closure. The Missing is available now wherever you get your podcasts, and early and ad-free on CrimeX Plus on Apple Podcasts.
It's all going a bit wrong. The ABC is now reporting that 5 boats have been intercepted by Australian Maritime Border Protection authorities off Western Australia's far north. They're all apparently intercepted within the past 24 hours, with the wooden boats in the mangroves around Kuri Bay, about 370 kilometres northeast of Broome. From the look of it, they could just be illegal fishing boats. I don't know. There's no talk about, we don't know if they were actually carrying people. Back in May, we did report at least 6 illegal boats had actually reached Australian territory since December. And that was then the 17th attempted people smuggling venture to make the journey here under this government. So again, we don't know what these boats are. 5 look suspicious. It might be that the Albanese government's being seen as a soft touch, and people wouldn't be wrong, would they? Now, there's a court case in Perth that, sorry, it seems a bit of a bash, but like I say, things are really going pear-shaped for this government. A court case in Perth that could really embarrass the government. You remember how the Brittany Higgins case exploded first in the media? You know, a story of how a rotten Morrison government covered up the rape of Brittany Higgins in the Parliament House office of their boss, Defence Minister Linda Reynolds, even trying to stop Higgins from going to the police.
Tonight, claims of rape, roadblocks to a police investigation, and a young woman forced to choose between her career and the pursuit of justice.
Tonight on Four Corners, we investigate how her story was kept secret for almost 2 years, and why she feels her cries for help were stifled by the Canberra machine and expectations of party loyalty.
Except the bulldust detector went right off there, and indeed these cover-up claims were called false by Justice Michael Lee in a separate case this year. But the Albanese government had already given Higgins $2.4 million of your money after just 1 day of mediation, in part for the terrible way, allegedly, the Liberals had treated her. And why? Well, that question is particularly pointed now because of this new court case. Linda Reynolds is suing Higgins and her husband for defamation, claiming they ruined her reputation and health by making her seem a villain, unsympathetic. I won't go through the ins and outs so far, but just one thing from Higgins' barrister in court in response that I thought was very interesting. Higgins' own barrister said Reynolds actually insisted Higgins go to the police about the rape. She claimed Reynolds nearly came to blows with her own chief of staff, who thought it was actually for Higgins to decide. Let me quote from a court report from The Australian. Rachel Young, SC, Higgins' barrister, said Reynolds' strong push to report the matter to Australian Federal Police showed that she must have known or at least suspected Higgins had been raped before she met the staffer to discuss the incident. Reynolds claims she didn't. But does that sound like a cover-up to you? Really? Now, of course, this doesn't mean Reynolds was sympathetic to Higgins, etc. That's for the court to decide. Joining me is Chris Merritt, Vice President of the Rule of Law Institute of Australia. Chris, thanks for your time, but what did you make of what Higgins' barrister said?
I agree with you. I can't see how this is anything but a strategic advantage for Miss Reynolds. The core of the argument, the defence argument, is that Miss Reynolds failed to support Miss Higgins and engaged in conduct that looked a lot like a cover-up. This seems to put that conclusively to bed. Now, we're only 3 days into a 5-week trial, but we do have a long way to go on this, but I think it'll be very difficult to overcome the clear message that Linda Reynolds wanted this complaint dealt with quickly by the police. I can't see how they can backtrack from that.
Now, of course, you know, the defamation claim is a bit wider, you know, that, oh, you said I was unsympathetic. They might say, well, in other ways you're unsympathetic, whatever. I don't know. But it's a very interesting concession. And it goes to the heart of the political dimension here. And I know you've talked about it, you've written about it. What of the Albanese government giving Brittany Higgins that $2,445,000 in compensation, in part for how cruelly Reynolds and the rest of the Morrison government allegedly gave her? How's that payment looking now when, for a start, the idea of a cover-up seems ludicrous?
It does. Regardless of the outcome of this case, I think the message should now be loud and clear that the rules governing payouts are less than rigorous. The way they work, the government has asserted that they've complied with the letter of the law, and they have. The problem is that there's an enormous loophole in the rules governing these payouts. The way it works is there must be a payout must be governed by legal practice and principle. If it's over $100,000, a lawyer must certify that there's a reasonable prospect of liability being found against the Commonwealth. Now, if both those things can't happen, there's a huge out for the government. All that needs to happen is that the Attorney-General needs to assert that special circumstances apply and a payout should be made, regardless of the fact that there might be no statement from a lawyer saying liability was likely to be found against the Commonwealth. Now, I don't think that's good enough, and I think this case, regardless of the outcome, shows that needs to be firmed up. If there was a legitimate basis for the payout, the rules should be so rigorous that there will be no doubt. But keep in mind that Miss Higgins, Miss Reynolds, who was Miss Higgins' employer, was excluded from the one-day mediation that led to this payout. And I can't see how that would comply with the requirement for legal practice and principle. So it looks like special circumstances.
She's getting a day in court. Now she's getting a day in court, Chris. And I think we're seeing a different story completely coming out, which might have been of benefit when well, I must say too, maybe they acted completely above board, but you can't help being suspicious of the fact or acknowledging a fact there's a vested interest here. It was in Labor's interest to say that Brittany Higgins was treated poorly because they used as a stick to beat the Liberals. They couldn't say, oh no, actually that didn't happen. Chris Merritt, thank you so much indeed for your insight there. Thank you so much. After the break, Donald Trump in deep trouble as Kamala Harris decides to shut up. But I'm playing you one bit of tape that shows why she's actually wise to. Woke and weird.
A troubled young woman. Her evil parents.
We never had any issues between us.
Has justice been done?
I'm in a prison.
Join journalist Richard Gilliatt as he delves into one of Australia's most gripping cases. Shadow of Doubt, a new podcast investigation from The Australian.
I cannot find one of these allegations that's possible.
Listen now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Silence sure is golden for Kamala Harris. Now, the US Democrats' last-minute decision to dump President Joe Biden and replace him with Harris in November's presidential election against Donald Trump is so far paying off big time. Polls show she's surged ahead of Trump, at least in the popular vote. And that's in part because in the nearly 3 weeks that Harris has been the candidate, she still has not given a single interview to a journalist or a single press conference, which is extraordinary. Except when you remember that Harris is still a hopelessly woke lightweight.
You know, we have to stay woke. Like, everybody needs to be woke. and you can talk about if you're the wokest or woker, but just stay more woke than less woke.
Now, to avoid embarrassments like that, she's only given tightly scripted speeches, really sticking to the text, except for one tiny slip. Very interesting, when she was with Biden last week, welcoming home prisoners freed by Russia, and tried to give Biden credit. She spoke only very briefly, but straight away didn't